we should sort of realize that at times Hinduism is a pretty feminist religion, right? Clearly they value and have strong female figures who are part of their history and legacy, and figures that can be used. What we think the problem is that at the moment, Hinduism is co-opted to hold back the progress of women, and that this kind of strategy is a particularly effective way of improving the cause of women in this country. To set up this debate, what do we purport these people should be doing? They should use these symbols and these figures and these gods, tell the stories of them, and try to explain why those stories and that cultural legacy explains why certain actions today that are feminist are acceptable or within India's cultural legacy. And I want to make two pieces of clarification. First of all, obviously other things still exist. These movements won't just only be Hindu nationalists who only talk about Hindu things. Second of all, we think these groups will try and actively work within Hindu religious groups to the extent that they're able. I want to make one piece of clarification before I get into arguments though, which is that if someone tries to say that this is going to cause divides between Hindus and Muslims, I'd make two observations. First of all, they by and large live in different provinces, so I think the arguments apply in different cases. But second of all, I do not think that it is likely that this and the actions of feminists are likely to be the determinative thing about Hindu-Muslim relations in the country. First argument, why this is particularly effective. Clarification? Sure.
Do you also support, as the motion states, adopting them as
violent
symbols of the movement?
It's a symbol, yeah, fine, okay. Effective. Women's rights in India have face shocking problems at the moment, right? There is endemic violence in lots of places, there's intense cultural pressure against women doing things like taking jobs and liberating themselves, and they can claim very often that feminist things are non-Indian and they're not part of the Indian cultural legacy. Why is this a useful tool? First of all, because we can co-opt Hindu nationalism as a political force. Let's recognize that Hindu nationalism, the BJP, are the predominant political force in the country at the moment, right? They control the majority of provincial governments, they control the government itself, and to the extent that we are allying ourselves with them and make ourselves seem like a more palatable alternative, it is more likely we can get those politicians to support our causes, which means that the government institutions itself are more likely to be on our side of the house. Second of all, we think we can co-opt the framework of belief. So very often feminist causes in lots of places, when they do start to push things that undermine cultural legacy or things that were natural cultural institutions that talked about the place of women, the argument is said that you're doing something that is against our culture. This argument specifically locates feminism within the historical religious framework of that country. Every time an argument is proffered that feminism is just undermining culture, they can say, no, what we're doing is appealing to our roots, the trueness of our religion. And more than that, there's an immense cultural value to things like religious story, right? This is the sort of thing that can go wild in places like Bollywood and stuff, if I'm perfectly honest, because when you use these stories, very emotive and visible stories, and get those sort of ideas out there in a very visceral way that can't be done with other mechanisms of deploying feminism in that cultural framework. The third reason I think this is effective is that it puts pressure on men, right? The fact that these are violent figures, I think validates a lot of things that women in India already have to do. There's already the things like the example, for instance, of the Gulabi gang, which are like Indian women who dress up in pink and go and beat men with sticks who are actively violent, right? Clearly the women in these communities themselves think that in order to protect themselves, they need to be actively violent in context. But when they do this, they could often face violent reprisals or the accusation they're doing things that are against the culture. When you point out that there were violent female symbols within Indian culture itself, that validates that sort of thing and makes that behavior more acceptable and more likely to occur, which puts more pressure on men if they're going to do things like aggressively assault women or do things that are actively anti-feminist. The fourth reason I think this is particularly good is that I think it makes feminism not just the preserve of the elite anymore, right? One of the often accusations you can make in this debate in India is that feminism, because by and large it proliferates through from, say, Western culture, is that it's just for people who are very rich in India, right? The elites, the people who are not the average person. This spreads feminism as an ideology to the average person, makes it more palatable in a broader sense, and makes it therefore more likely to actually achieve tangible effects. The impact of all of this argumentation, right, is that this sort of mechanism seems like a particular effective way to deploy feminism not just more effectively in the context where it occurs, but more broadly, and to expand the scope of options available for feminists and women in India who are already trying to pursue things like violent liberation because they deem that as a necessary thing and the only way to guarantee their protection. That's why this is incredibly important. Now, if someone on the opposition bench tries to say there'll be backlash, right, and people will be angry about you trying to co-opt our symbols. First of all, we have the very good retort that this is literally their history, right? We didn't invent this, we just took the stories they already believe in. The second of all, I think that anything feminism does is going to face backlash in heavily conservative countries. So I think that's symmetrized on both sides of the house. Second of all, on empowering women, I think it is important to note that if they say, they cannot argue this by just saying that this might be a bad policy for the following reason. I think that Hinduism, if an attempt is not made to co-opt it into a feminist thing, will continue to be actively anti-feminist, right? For instance, take the Hindu practice of suti, EUDC, where a widow is either burned at the pyre, or if she's allowed to continue living, she has all of her jewellery and stuff taken away from her, she's not allowed to get a job, and that traps large quantities of women into situations from which they cannot liberate themselves. Those sorts of things are things that become prominent in Hinduism because no one attempts to point out the bits of Hinduism that are actively feminist, right? In the absence of an attempt by feminists to take the bits that can break that deadlock where cultural institutions and the fact that societies are broadly patriarchal has allowed the patriarchal elements of religion to take hold and take prominence, what we are likely to see is that huge force, that huge volume of cultural and institutional power that Hinduism has in India deployed against feminism and hold that back. And that is the thing that realistically screws over women in rural India, the most disadvantaged people in this debate and the people who need that sort of help. Before I move on, opening.
OG, don't understand polytheism. The fact that there are certain gods who support this in the pantheon doesn't mean it's consistent with the religion's moral decrees. Specifically, every pantheon has bad, violent gods which behave immorally according to that religion's decrees.
I do not think you are legendarily knowledgeable enough to claim that all of the gods who are violent are also the evil gods, right? They're not all like the Hades of, the Indian pantheon realistically, right? And I think just doesn't understand the veneration and the value that a god has, right? Even if it is not morally obviously good, right? It has an incredible degree of veneration and cultural value. It is this person who's they're involved in the stories that you append the most significant cultural value to, and you think are indicators of things like moral worth more broadly. I guarantee you there are examples the feminists can find, Hindu feminists can find, of these women these female gods doing things that are productive. Now, to clarify what the impact of this argument is, if you do not have a way of reconciling Hinduism with feminism, the reality for women in India is one in which those institutions are always going to be oppositional to you, right? One in which you do not have a retort when Hindu religious groups say that your behaviour in attempting to economically liberate yourself or empower yourself, or being violent when a man is violent back to you, or demanding that you should have a job or that you have a prominent position in society, they can claim that it is religiously oppositional and something that is deeply anti-cultural. Even if we are not perfectly successful, notice that we can win this debate in increments, right? Even if we only make some portions of Hindu religious people more feminist, or even if we slightly expand the scope of things that are plausible within the sphere of Hinduism, that makes it more likely those women can empower themselves on the margin. Look, these women already think they need to resort to violence in order to liberate themselves. I suspect the reasons they have for being violent are very similar to the reason their gods have for being violent in their stories, and we propose.
I want to be very clear at the start of this speech about what the women's rights movement in India needs to be successful. We think it needs two things. First of all, it needs buy-in from the vast majority of women in India. We think John is absolutely right that historically it has been an elite movement, and many women in India are reluctant to self-identify as anti-feminist and form the critical mass that is needed to effect actual change. If we can prove that this policy turns women away, they lose this debate. Secondly, it needs male support, right? You cannot have change in India where the vast majority of wealth and political structures are still controlled by men without some buy-in from men into the movement in terms of enacting that legislative change in the first place, but also enforcing it. We would note that sati is illegal in India, but it is not enforced in rural areas because men don't consider it their responsibility to actually enforce those laws. We need buy-in from a broad spectrum of men on their side of the house. If we can prove they don't get that, they also lose this debate. Unsurprisingly then, my speech will be first of all why this turns women away from the feminist movement in India, and secondly, why it alienates men from that movement. Before that, just to establish the comparative in this debate, what we stand for in opening opposition is that the feminist movement should use historical and current actual women and feminist figures in India, such as Bollywood actresses. We also think that they should enter a dialogue with Hinduism to change those features of it that are oppressive. We don't think this needs to be done through adopting the symbols, as John claimed at the end of his speeches. Before I go into my main substantive, I just want to point out a couple of OG premises that I think are problematic. First of all, that there is a clear connection between the policy that women's movements are advocating and what Kali and Shiva and these other violent goddesses represent. We think opening government provide one kind of policy that women's movements lead in India, which is women using violence to defend themselves. That legitimises that policy. More on that later. But secondly, we give them no reason why women need to say stop doing sati, given that is also a part of the Hindu religion. No reason why you need to implement educational reforms to get more women into education just because you have the violent symbol of Kali at the head of your movement. We think the logic there was flawed. But second of all, their premise is that the uses of these gods will be accepted by the mainstream of both men and women. More in my speech later about why that won't be the case. Let's talk about how this turns women away. First of all, there are 0.5 billion people in India that are Muslim. It's interesting that opening government tried to mech these people out of the debate by saying, they live in different areas. I mean, obviously in Delhi they don't, and they clash often, which is why it's in the Indian press a lot about tensions between these groups. These Muslim women are important in this debate because they have existed in a historically antagonistic relationship with Hinduism. No, thank you. We think at best these symbols are meaningless to them, right? The fact that Hindu women may be empowered to commit violence means nothing to a Muslim woman who doesn't have those same symbols. Indeed, they might be more likely to look to Quranic indictments against violence more than these Hindu symbols. But secondly, we think it actually turned them away because feminism is now more easy to be tarnished as un-Islamic because it's a Hindu movement rather than a Muslim movement. We think it's important to note that Kali doesn't just stand over the corpses of her enemies that are men, she stands over the corpses of her enemies that are other ethnic groups. For all the women in India that are not Hindu, I'll take closing in a second, this is not an empowering symbol. Go ahead.
So why can't we use strong Muslim females like the Prophet Muhammad's wife Aisha to also inspire Muslim women?
I mean, there's literally an opportunity cost, right? We think it's very difficult for you to use both as prominent symbols, given you have a particularly limited amount of airtime, where feminism is a very small movement in India under the status quo. This is a problem alienating Muslim women because they are often vulnerable to the most oppressive practices on opening government side of the house. We need their support to agitate for change within their own communities. Now they are much less likely to join women's groups in the first place, to access the support services they need. That literally leaves women worse off under their side of the house. Secondly, let's talk about Hindu women. We think appropriating symbols of a religion that has historically been used to oppress women is problematic for those women. Why? Something like sati that John talks about, where widows have to throw themselves on a burning pyre of their husband, is a Hindu practice. Something like Dalit women being told that their position in the social hierarchy is a function of where they stand in the reincarnation of life is a problem that Hinduism has perpetuated. We think at best on their side, women are aware that Hinduism is an oppressive religion. If you then co-opt those symbols, those women resent that movement for not representing their needs and interests. It remains an elite movement for Hindu women for whom Hinduism is not so oppressive as it is for Dalit women or women in rural areas who are still subject to sati. That's a problem. But we think even if these women self-identify as Hinduism and don't see a problem with their religion, we think you are then less able to engage in that dialogue with the oppressive Hindu practices. We don't understand why just having Shiva as a symbol of your feminist movement means you're more able to critique the oppressive practices. Indeed, you're more likely to think that Hinduism and feminism are inherently compatible and less likely to subject it to the scrutiny that you need to actually get change. That's why you alienate women from the movement, and that's why it becomes less effective on their side. But let's talk about alienating men. Like they said, of course Op is going to run the backlash material. It's obviously much more complicated than that because we're talking about a group of men that hold a vast majority of political power, and we actually need them to not be turned away from the movement to enact the legislative change that Indian women actually need in their lives. First of all, Muslim men. Again, it's quite intuitive that if you think feminism is becoming a predominantly un-Islamic religion, then it justifies you saying that un-Islamic movement, it justifies you saying it is not Islamic, it is not applicable in your areas, and ignoring its demands entirely. In terms of Hindu men, I mean, they just assert that Hindu men will accept the appropriation of these symbols. A couple of reasons why they would say that this is a misappropriation. First of all, we think these are, just the one reason actually, because it is female incarnations of the life force of the universe rather than being actual women. I think they can say Kali is not meant to provide a model for what actual women should do in their lives because she is a goddess. It's almost blasphemous for you to claim that you should use her as your model, in the same way it would be blasphemous to claim that I should do exactly all the things that Rama does in my life. Crucially, we think it is much easier to reconcile yourself, no thank you, to thousands of years of patriarchal and oppressive theology than it is to change your position on what that theology might represent. The impact of this is that lots of men that might have been sympathetic to feminism on our side of the house get more distant from it because it seems more extreme, less reasonable, at the point at which it seems to be literally advocating violence with very limited theological basis. But finally, let's talk about men who perpetrate violence, because this is what OG makes us make all of the debate about. The problem with these men is that they see feminism as a war against men and against their privileges. We think it's one thing for women to collectively organise to defend themselves. It is another for an entire movement to paint themselves as saying the violence those women commit is not only justified, it is to be celebrated across the entire movement. We think those men are then more likely to perpetrate violence against women because they say the women too are seeing this as a war against man, between man and woman, and we need to prevent them from winning and prevent them from attacking our privileges. That means that the women in rural areas that are getting attacked at the moment on their side of the house, they want to base their entire case around get more oppressed on our side. This alienates the two key groups that the women's movement in India needs to succeed. That's why I'm very proud to oppose.
That there is a necessary trade-off in this debate, which is that the more watered down and the more palatable the version of feminism that all seeks to champion, the less effective I think feminism in India necessarily is. Because if they stand for feminism that doesn't challenge the idea that women have the right to be violent, have the right to be assertive, I think on the whole you get a very watered down movement that still ultimately cows the demands and overriding perceptions of men. That is not a brand of feminism I'm willing to defend. So if at worst, the worst outcome on our side is that we make more men angry, or that this takes a longer time for the movement to succeed, both of which I don't think are true, I think this is still ultimately a duty that a feminist movement in India has a duty to uphold. I'm going to do a couple of things. First, take down O's case. Second, point out how their lack of response to John's material was so damning to them in this debate. First, I'm going to talk about three things that O gave us. The first thing they suggested was their policy, and the policy had two prongs. One, dialogue, and two, Bollywood. Like, there are just a couple of problems with this, right? The first thing I would like to point out is that Bollywood's images of women tend to be incredibly sexualized, not something we think is a good idea. But more than that, a lot of the resistance that comes from Bollywood is that it's very whitewashed, right? The women you see in Bollywood tend to very much have paler skin tones, which a lot of Indian women in India can't identify with. Again, no analysis as to why that's more effective than appealing to a religious basis for feminism. Last of all, if they tell us that dialogue is going to be effective, then that presumes that men and women in India have some degree of rationality. So I'm not sure the immense backlash that they seem to think will result on their side, won't result on their side, will necessarily transpire on our side. No, they gave you no substantiation for why their counter policy is going to succeed in any universe out there, right? So if their policy of dialogue is going to succeed, I think our alternative is a lot more reasonable than that, and a lot more likely to get buy-in. Second thing, on the Hindu-Muslim divide, John already preempted this by suggesting that by and large, Muslim and Hindu feminist groups tend to operate in very different spheres, in very different provinces. But note that our policy is not mutually exclusive, with Muslim feminist groups appealing to their own symbols as well. Gave us no reason why the Hindu feminist group has to define feminism all across India. The two can exist together. We see this all across in China, where you have feminist symbols representing elite feminists, like the more urban class of feminism, as well as other symbols representing more rural Chinese women instead. But second, they told us that no, it's bad because Hindu women in Hinduism, Hindu goddesses, are seen as conquering other ethnic minorities. Like, that's just factually untrue from the Infoslide, because Kali is standing on top of the Hindu God Shiva. So if that is the analysis for the backlash, it's just factually inaccurate. The third thing I want to point out is this. They told us that it's bad if this causes harms to Muslim women, because they're often the most vulnerable in society. I will make the modest claim that helping Hindu feminism gain more traction ultimately benefits Muslim women in India as well. For the simple reason they themselves gave us, right, that the main institutions of power are still very much centralized in the hands of Hindus, for instance the BJP. So if we have proof, and I think we have, that this helps Hindu feminism in the long run, I think that spillover benefits also ultimately benefit Muslim women as well. The third thing they told us, backlash. Okay, there are a couple of reasons under this. The first is that you will accuse Hindu females of misappropriating the culture. Like, I first want to point out this is a slightly at odds with their own mechanism of how dialogue is going to function, right? If reasonable little dialogue is possible on their side. I think a reasonable religious interpretation of the different kinds of Hindu gods and goddesses on our side is possible as well. But second, I think a discussion over misappropriation of religion or Hindu goddesses is at least a lot more civil and something that at least society is willing to participate in. The main problem in the status quo is that there's no incentive at the moment to even consider or engage in anything that's related to feminism. So if their worst case scenario is that Hindu feminist groups are going to be accused of misappropriation, I think that's still a net gain for our side, because at least there are men who are participating and involved in this discussion. The second thing I want to point out, and this is crucial, is that the main barrier to feminism in India today is the idea of Hinduism. The idea that Hindu cannot accommodate feminism, the idea that Hinduism is necessarily at odds with feminism. I think the moment we make an attempt to make some inroad in breaking that kind of like false oppositional dichotomy that exists, it is a very powerful thing for Hindu women out there. The last thing he told us is that men will get more violent because now Hindu women are seen as being violent, right? The first thing I want to point out is that this ignores the reality where many women have the reality of violence by men visited upon them. But nonetheless, they are too cowed into taking up arms in self-defense because they believe that that is not their role to be assertive in society. To the extent that using religion as a motivating factor, as a narrative that tells women it's okay to be assertive because that's not something that is not like anti-Hindu, I think that itself is a huge gain on our side because women are more empowered to stand up for themselves. But second, I just don't think men are going to become even more violent just because of like an image of Hindu goddess on TV, like standing on top of a Hindu god, right? Again, I have no reason to believe why that is going to be the tipping point that drives more violence. What did John tell you? No, a couple of things. The first thing, and he gave you specific mechanisms as to why this is going to be effective, right? The first thing he told you was that you aligned Hindu nationalism with like feminism. This is especially important for the reasons that OO gave us, that a lot of the powers of being able to make institutional changes are centralized in the hands of Hindu parties, like the BJP for instance. Crucially, this means that when the BJP caters and appeals to their voter base of Hindus, they can also cater like by championing feminism as a cause without necessarily upsetting their voter base. This makes it a lot more politically palatable and makes it more likely that feminism is going to be an electoral issue in the first place. Closing.
A theological discussion of feminism and Hinduism is not mutually exclusive with the motion. How is that discussion helped by adopting Kali as a prominent symbol?
Okay, I think there are two distinctions here. The first is that it becomes like a centerpiece of the feminist movement, right? So to the extent that it tells very clearly and unequivocally that Hinduism and feminism are not at odds with each other, I think it's net gain on our side. But second, I think it has to be prominent because otherwise it will simply fall into the background and the benefits or harms that either side talks about will simply not transpire, right? The second thing John told you was that a large inhibition to participating or buying the feminism these days is the idea that you are undermining the traditional Indian culture instead of upholding it. I want to point out this got no response from OO, and I think that is fatal to their side. But the other thing he told you is that feminism is no longer seen as a preserve of the elites. OO said that, no, but you leave oppressive structures like Suri in the rural areas there because you don't critique it. I think again, once we start overturning the idea that Hinduism is necessarily at odds with feminism, that itself is what allows us to create the framework of mind for people to start critiquing and thinking about whether practices like not allowing female widows out there to go out and work or to interact with their in-laws is even acceptable practice in the first place. The comparative is one where people don't ever think it is legitimate to discuss such issues or not feel the impetus to discuss such issues simply because there is no need to. The impact of which are, as OO claims, we now get more women who subscribe to feminism because we remove this important religious barrier, and also that we get more men on board. The last thing John told you is that this is important in overturning and uprooting internalized sexism within women. Women for whom never dare to be assertive or violent or to liberate themselves through the means of force because no one else has told them, no authoritative voice has told them that it's permissible to do so. The important thing here is that it is a Hindu goddess whom they venerate for thousands of years who tells them, you finally have the power to do that. And I think that is what is stand for.
Let's be very clear on something. OG premise, an OG case is premised on the idea that you can reinterpret those symbols, and this reinterpretation is going to be effective for the people that we care about in this debate and are currently misogynistic and don't buy into feminism because it's seen as at odds with Hinduism. Unless they can prove that this reinterpretation is going to affect those people, they cannot win this debate. We do not believe that they have proven that, because most people in question, such as conservative Hindus, only have superficial contact with feminism. They will see these symbols interpreted in their own historical context rather than new, fluffy 21st century feminist interpretation of Kali. We think this is where the case falls. 2 bits of rebuttal, then some extension points. So in rebuttal, let's firstly talk about Muslims, right? Because they just try and make this out of the debate, right? So first of all, just on a meta-debate point, insofar as the motion says female rights groups in India, I think you have to defend female rights groups in India, not parts of India where it would happen to be useful because there is a lot of Hindus. Even if you want to make this out and make it very narrow, we just tell you in a lot of parts of India, it is factually true that those groups coexist, such as Delhi, that it's literally almost factually split 50-50. Insofar as metropolitan areas are the ones that are most likely to affect change, this is super important, right? Thirdly, we tell you, right, oftentimes change is done nationally because internet exists, because these groups cooperate. You make that cooperation impossible. At that point, you fragment this movement nationally between provinces that are Muslim and the provinces that are Hindu. Insofar as you need to vote, you do votes nationally for federal legislation, you make it harder under their side of the house, right? So we just don't think that they dealt with it and just try to make it out. We don't think that's legitimate. The second point I want to raise in regards to OG is this thing about reinterpretation, because note, most people who are Hindu are probably, and by their own premise, aren't, super feminist, aren't going to get into nuanced reinterpretations of history as to how Kali might be construed as feminist. No, thank you. What they will see instead are the intuitive, traditional interpretations of Kali, which are that she is evil, she is a conqueror, right? We know to you that she doesn't only stand on a body of God, she wears a necklace of skulls. Those are skull people she conquered, oftentimes other ethnic groups, oftentimes Muslims. This is oftentimes associated with the groups that Hindus have oppressed in the past, right? They can't just say that people are going to see that as a feminist reinterpretation unless they explain a mechanism how that happens, right? Note that even for women within the movement who might want to be feminists, this can be seen as oppressive. You alienate them as well because they themselves see Kali as someone who oppresses them, because traditionally, historically, she's a part of religion that brought you Suti, right? She's a part of religion that did say that women are a lower caste because of reincarnation, because of their position of power, because what they did in their past life. So we do not believe that they proved what they were set out to prove. We think OG is out. Cool. No. Extension point number 1. On provoking attacks, right? OG tells you that oftentimes groups already have to resort to violence, therefore this isn't a legitimate thing to point to when they resort to violence. Here's a crucial difference though, right? A Gulabi gang uses face masks, they're in groups, they have some sort of protection. Now you associate all the feminists with that kind of violence, right? You don't legitimize it, you associate them between each other. So what that means is that now every feminist that goes on a bus in the night, no thank you, is seen as someone potentially violent, is seen as condoning the kind of violence that the Gulabi gang inflicts on men. She's much more likely to be assaulted. Not only does it lead to violence to all the feminists who can't opt out of this association, but it also makes them less likely to join because they're afraid they're going to be assaulted. This is why the quote-unquote generic backlash point, as John wants to refer to it, is important in this debate. Because you hurt women, you alienate them further. There's a massive harm that you can't just gloss over. Secondly, right, just something I want to point out, right, but just remember this, should have done it at the beginning. We don't have a counterprop. We just think that their thing is actively harmful, right? Like, just so, like, because F wanted to, like, paint as if we have now a counterprop. We don't. We just think, like, what you're doing is kind of shit, right? So, this decreases political support, right? Note, it is true that India has its problems in pushing for legislative change, but it's untrue that there has been no legislative change, right? We have managed to criminalize Suti, right? We have managed to provide compulsory education for all women. Those are federal legislative successes that become less likely under their side of the house. First of all, because federally you alienate Muslims. You alienate people who don't buy into Hinduism who might also be secular, right? You alienate the kinds of people who are Hindu but feel oppressed by Hinduism, right? You get fewer votes, fewer push for political change, right? But secondly, right, you also alienate men. Those are people who mostly consist in the vast majority of parliaments because you associate feminist groups with the kind of violence that Gulabi gang inflicts on men, right? This is why they're less likely to vote for this change. But secondly, why this might be particularly important in context of India is because this change now also becomes less universalizable. Because if a Hindu state adopts it, Muslim states are less likely, Muslim provinces are less likely to adopt it because it's seen as a Hindu change. It's a feminist change specifically grounded in Hinduism, not in anything Muslim. Muslim. On the comparative, if you have all the women campaigning for this change, it's much more likely that multiple provinces and the federal change happens that just helps utilitarian metric more women. I don't think closing that happen. No, thank you. All right, so these changes are therefore less universalizable, therefore fewer women can be helped. Right? Lastly, what does this do to Muslim, firstly to Hindus, secondly to Muslims, right? Note, crucially we think this removes the ability of the feminist movement to criticize Hinduism and Hindu practices, because they're now explicitly associating themselves with a culture that has provided those practices, because Kali and Shiva, even if they are to some extent feminists, right, in general are still part of that culture that has to exist in a particular historical context, and you can't just disassociate it from it with, fluffy quote-unquote reinterpretation, whatever the fuck that means, right? What this means then is that you're less likely to criticize things like Suti, right? You're less likely to criticize things that Hinduism in the past has created to oppress women, right? And also, crucially, Hindus are now less likely to to respect those laws, right? Because they see, because they might think that, federal law might be feminist, but they also see that there is some legitimacy in the role of religion in that feminism, right? So suddenly it is not clear that you should be a feminist. Suddenly you send a message that there's a trade-off between being religious and respecting Hinduism, but also being a feminist, right? It makes those people much less likely to criticize Hindu practices, but also not abide the laws that criticize and ban Hindu practices. Lastly, it's just very, very, very shit for Muslims, right? Look, at the moment, oftentimes, especially moderate women, prioritize their identity as women and their oppression as women over their religious identity, right? This makes it less likely that they're going to do that, right? Because now joining a movement makes that movement oppositional to their religious belief. This is not a cause that they currently have, and currently they can prioritize their female identity. Under their side of the house, they have to decide whether their religious identity as a Muslim or as a secular Indian is more or less important than their identity and oppression as a woman. This just means they do not buy in, and those who are already in there feel massively, massively attacked by this move. This is just a shit policy that provokes attacks on women, decreases political capital, and fundamentally misunderstands the role of symbols in religions. I'm happy to oppose.
I didn't speak without speech. I'm like, you never put it up. Here.
The opening government tell us that creating an association between women's rights groups and Hinduism is a good thing for those groups. What they don't explain is the precise mechanism by which adopting a symbol creates an association. Note panel, this is the fundamental disagreement in the top half, because the opening opposition's counterclaim is that when you adopt the symbol, not only do you not create that association, you actually actively anger people. So what this debate requires is an analysis of exactly how symbols operate in the psychology of individual people. I'm going to deepen this debate beyond the simplistic characterization that Indian men and women will either be super angry or be super supportive. I think there's a middle ground by which symbols operate on psychology insidiously and over the long term, and that's what I'm going to look at in this speech. I'll give you 3 mechanisms by which symbols operate. Firstly, by the end of this, I'll respond to the opening up. So firstly, symbols activate dormant ideas, right? So the premise here is that Hinduism does have prominent female characters, right? Characters who are strong, who wield violence just as much and as effectively as men do, and are respected as much as them. That's the premise of this debate entirely. Furthermore, note that people know about this, right? Like Hindu individuals are aware of their own stories and of their own and the characters within those stories. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why is it that despite the fact that your religion contains a panoply of powerful female characters, social attitudes towards women remain so conservative, remain as assuming that they are subservient and weak? The reason for this is that people create a mental distinction between otherworldly religious icons and the physical world we live in, right? And I think this is just true. Like, we assume that the characters we see in our religious texts belong to a different world altogether, belong to a spiritual world that's not connected to the present world in which we live. And that's the reason people can dissociate between the women they see on the streets and the women they hear about in their stories. We change this for 2 reasons. Firstly, adopting a symbol creates a connection between these 2 things. We recognize that people don't respond to this homogeneously, right? But people often encounter symbols which play on their subconscious in insidious ways, you start to be reminded that the women you see on the streets are actually not really much different, right, from those characters in the stories. An association might never have made prior to seeing that particular symbol being used, especially when there are feminists who actively promote these symbols and explain what that particular connection is between your divinely held beliefs and the actual world in which you live. But secondly, it's important to make these symbols prominent, and here is why. The comparative is that the Hindu story is told exclusively by male voices, and that is even worse than on their side of the house. It means that you actually discourage associating women with the powerful religious symbols whom you see in your stories, and it's harder for that movement to gain traction when there is exclusively one voice prominently promoting these symbols. How does this actually play out? I think the first thing is that it will actually make people think. And surprisingly enough, that sometimes, causes people to change the way the beliefs they hold, right? It might well be that some people will say, actually, these stories are not so distant after all from my daily life. But importantly, the conversations you have about these stories now become stronger. The reason for this is that you sanctified the female body. This is because, in order for you to reject the association between figures like Kali and women living today, you have to either reject the femininity of these icons, which is difficult because it requires challenging your basic beliefs, or you have to reject their strength, which is also difficult because that involves claiming that prominent symbols in your own, who figure in your own historical tradition, aren't as important after all. So it makes the conversation more powerful on the sides of women's rights groups. It's harder for you to challenge these particular icons once that association has at least begun to appear in the minds of individual people. Secondly, symbols resonate with people. Premise here, feminism is a pretty strange thing to many people, right? I mean, we assume by default that people know about it, but, think about it. Feminism is couched in a mysterious private language. Microaggressions, patriarchy, rape culture. These are concepts which aren't familiar to the ordinary person, and especially because it's so bounded up in a Western legacy. Do you know what is familiar to the average person? Their faith. The stories you tell that they've become familiar with are easy access routes to expressing concepts that would otherwise be too distant for people to internalize. Again, I suspect that change will be slow, but at the very least, the language is now one which people can participate in and understand comprehensively. It's crucial. Crucially then, one important way in which people respond to this is by this enables people to justify to themselves organizing in violent ways, right? Because frequently there is a presumption that women ought to defend themselves, even though they really should. I think you change that when you give them a symbology that they can understand more fully than distant feminist language from the Western world that enables them to justify those actions to themselves. Finally, symbols need to be reclaimed. The opening opposition says, Kali, Hinduism are bound up with oppression, with an oppressive legacy. That is true. Note, however, that firstly, they are still respected characters who people respond to positively by and large. And secondly, if that is true, it is important to rewrite the stories that these characters have. To say that, and I mean, we do this with all historical figures, right? We say they did some pretty bad things, but look at what they stood for. Look at these principles. Let's try and reinterpret their actions within the context that people can understand and respond to positively. I think that's a conversation you get instead of opening up the assumption that people will just homogeneously respond to this in a terrible way. Let's engage now with the opening before that.
Okay, so why do we want Hindu men to associate women with symbols that are inherently violent against other men and against Muslims?
I mean, I think we want to associate them with women with two things. Firstly, prominent symbols who ought to be respected, right? That's number one. Secondly, note that you've ignored analysis about how this sanctifies the female body, right? It's harder for you to justify violence against a person when you understand that they are, that they are not less of a person than you are, that they are just as valuable and important and sacred as the historical figures who appear in your religious tradition. So firstly, opening up says this alienates Muslims. I think that we can sensibly use more than one symbol, including Muslim symbols, in these programs. The response that we hear from LO is, there's an opportunity cost to doing this. I think we see this not as an opportunity cost, but as an opportunity, because we can prove that there are powerful figures across all religions who are equally committed, or who can equally represent the cause of women's rights. That creates broader outreach by showing that there is actually consilience. Secondly, they say this alienates women. Right, so, I mean, this is true of all attempts to engender change of any sort that requires reinterpreting any kind of long-held belief, right? The difference is that you've introduced a language within which people can believe that it's possible to be Hindu and a feminist at the same time. In the long term, I think that backlash dissipates in favor of introducing a conversation that people can understand and access more broadly. The long term is more important here because, I mean, there are just many, many more lives in the next 100 years than there are in the next 10. Thirdly, they say this alienates men, right? And the crucial link they give here is that this makes men more violent. The problem, panel, is that genuinely, violence against women is such horrific levels across India that I'm not sure that the marginal difference here is significant. The difference this makes is you enable women to organize in ways that protect themselves more meaningfully against that violence. So that's the concrete difference that our side brings and that tempers this violence in general. Look, when you're evaluating this debate, you have to ask yourself, which team has explained how symbols interact with psychology? I think we're the only team to do with that. And that's the reason why I'm very proud to stand on this.
Emasculation. Possibly the word in the English language which has caused the most suffering and subjugation to women. Possibly the word in the English language which has persevered the oppression of women and maintained current gender dynamics more than any other word. That very word embodied symbolically by the goddess Kali, sitting on top of an emasculated male. This is what we will now have feminism in India be associated with, and we say, firstly, this creates immense backlash by men, specifically through the image of emasculation. Secondly, this lessens support by women. And thirdly, we say it's bad for women to take violent risks on themselves in the name of a failing movement. To engage with the speech we just heard, well, not much engagement is needed, right? Most of the speech is entirely off clashes. Both top half teams agree that there will be an association of the goddess Kali with feminism. And therefore, Darian spends 6 minutes proving what was already agreed upon. Admittedly in an eloquent way, good job, but something which was already agreed upon and is insubstantial in the debate. Because that association happens when people are afraid of Kali. Because in that'll get to later. And this association will be bad for women. Secondly, on the fact that it will make women defend themselves, direct engagement in the case. Thirdly, that this somehow sanctifies a woman's body. We say, firstly, this is very assertive. Secondly, within the pantheon, this doesn't even happen, as other gods act violently upon that goddess within the pantheon stories. And thirdly, we say the god itself is violent. So to what extent are they anti-violent in any substantial way? Because you give it, you probably should be able to get. Before I move on to my case, 2 brief problems with our OG. Firstly, most of the MEC is not mutually exclusive. An interfaith conversation is just fine. The only part which is unique to the motion, John glosses over by saying, yeah. Well, that's what you should have defended, the actual mechanization of those prominent symbols. And when they don't engage with that, they fail. Second problem across government bench is that they assume that the fact that something exists within a religion means that it will be recognized, but they don't understand how polytheistic religions work. They just conflate that with monotheism. They don't understand that in a polytheistic religion, the virtuous gods like Ganesh in Hinduism or like Zeus in Greek gods actually convey the moral basis that most virtuous people should act upon, and other gods embody other urges which are bad and not moral and don't necessarily mean that society should respect the choices they convey. Firstly, on backlash specifically through emasculation. We say that the biggest problem that feminism has faced is that perception of castration, that perception of emasculation, and feminism will never work as long as that association exists. Firstly, why that? Because men are also socialized to want to be masculine. Men also feel like they are being tested by their masculinity, by their power constantly. And so that directly threatens the core issues of their identity. This is especially true in a patriarchal society like India, but this is also true for most men in this room. They are constantly tested on being masculine, and specifically being more masculine and more powerful than women. Secondly, we say, Secondly, we say that this is exactly the mechanism by which the emotional association is created, which makes it matter that feminism is mutually exclusive with respecting the rights of men. That women want to take from men all that they have, all the social privileges that they have, and also all of the things that make them men and that make them virtuous men by that culture. We say Kali directly embodies that. Why? A few levels. Firstly, the image. The very image of a woman sitting upon possibly the most powerful, bad god in the Hindu pantheon is just immensely threatening. The fact that that god could emasculate the most powerful of gods means that women threaten to emasculate men, and the co-opting of that image means that women want to threaten to emasculate men. This is an incredibly powerful image because it taps into the innermost fears of men being afraid of that emasculation. Secondly, the religious power of that image. We say that the sort of emotions that image floods when you see it creates an almost unbreakable association between feminism and emasculation. And emasculation is exactly the thing which is correlated firstly with an irrational hate of feminism, but secondly conflated with the fact that feminist policies are perceived to come only at the expense of men. We say firstly, in a society dominated by men, this prevents any progress being made by the women because now men are incentivized to actively resist something which seeks to emasculate them and which they perceive negatively from the outset. The first thing they hear about it, they associate negatively, and they try to find facts that contradict it because they have such a negative association. Secondly, we say it creates a deeper dissociation of women with that image because most women in India don't want to be emasculating. They're women who have homes, they're women who have families, they're women who maybe have a certain job, and they don't want to associate with something that their husband is so very much against. Opening, yeah, go.
Like, your whole case just falls into the trap of presuming that equivocating and passive feminism will work in a country that has huge Hindu forces that are pushing against feminism. Unless you work within that framework, you don't get any
Thanks. Here's the rebuttal that I'm tired of hearing. Things are shit now, so they can't get worse. No! Things can get so much worse. You think that people in India are the maximal amount of violence that they can be towards women, and nothing can ever make that worse? Enough of this already. Secondly, I'll mention some advancements which were made by feminism. Good job, OO. So, on women, so we also explained to you why women wouldn't support it because they're socialized in exactly the same opposite way. Third, why it's bad for women to take these risks. We say that the rest of society hasn't really changed. It's still dangerous to be sexually assertive or to be violent or to even be assertive in a normal way within an interpersonal relationship. It's still dangerous to walk on the street alone in India in many areas. Why do we think that this particularly makes that damage worse? Because men who feel threatened, feel emasculated, are more likely to act violently toward women, specifically women who identify with that movement, but also all women. We say that this specifically gets worse because we know that sexual assault is not about sex. Sexual assault is about the asserting of power. And we see that this is the exact thing which is made worse by the association with power. We say it's unfair to make low-class women take that risk for high-class women because they don't have a big voice in the movement, because they carry the brunt and the majority of the risk, because they are the ones most influenced by the religious narrative in their environment, and because they are the ones in the least progressive areas. So when those women try to resist their husbands, the outcome would have been worse had if they stayed submissive. We know staying submissive is not ideal, but it's better than suffering violence. Thanks.
And I can speak of that speech.
Okay, considering the Infoslide explicitly cites Kali, a goddess that wears men's skull around her neck and literally standing over a man lying submissively, and the motion clearly says violent female goddesses, we find it odd that most of the debate hasn't been around that crucial part of the motion. Therefore, 3 questions you should ask yourself at the end of the debate. Firstly, how men are actually likely to react to that symbol being prominent? Secondly, how does it affect the ability to have women advocacy for these groups? And thirdly, even if you accept that you're going to get legitimization for self-defense and assertiveness, is that actually a good thing in India right now? All of the rebuttal is going to be integrated. Let's dive right in. So let's talk about male reaction, because opening opposition give you the short of the case. Right? I tell you, Muslims are going to be unhappy about it because it is a Hindu symbol. Opening government mostly tell you, we show that Hinduism plus feminism equals love, and therefore everybody's gonna love that sort of thing. What we can do specifically is 2 crucial things. A, what it means to use a violent symbol specifically, and secondly, as Don tells in his POI framing, how these religions work, and by legitimization and acceptance of that within other groups isn't likely. Let's start with the first one. So opening opposition already started the case, right? I tell you, it strengthened the idea of feminism as a war, and that they are going to be now recognized as extremely violent groups under status quo. That could be the case. But we need to understand what drives currently large political opposition to feminism, both individually, socially, and as political groups. And this is the unique analysis that my partner brings to you. Because the problem they have with feminism is not that they literally hate women, or they think that women shouldn't have liberties, right? That is not their issue with feminism. It is the concept that feminism and women's rights are mutually exclusive with theirs. It is the notion that if women gain rights, it is going to be on their behalf, that they're going to be emasculated, that they're going to lose their jobs, that they're going to lose their rights, that they're going to feel unsafe. We then continue and tell you why specifically these symbols are extremely harmful. Because when OG tell you, well, everything that benefits women is going to cause backlash, we have to understand what specifically drives these groups. Because different notions of promoting feminism cause different amounts of backlash significantly. Because when the symbol is now a symbol that is promoting the idea of literally submitting men to women, of literally, we have to be violent. It has to be on the expense of men. This means you're going to see a lot more support for these groups. A lot of more men are saying it is true. Those beliefs you might thought were true, or thought were maybe even significantly true, are now things that the feminist movements claim themselves to be true. This is their prominent symbols. This is how you create the problem of not allowing women to have basic rights because they are a threat. This is where you get strengthening of people who are in the middle ground that CG are talking about to join these groups. So at the end of the day, you create immense harm to them. But secondly, we tell you that both governments are being extremely naive about how religions works, and specifically Hinduism. Because when they say they're going to accept this sort of goddess because it is part of their religion, they don't understand that that goddess is fighting other gods and goddesses. They can tap into, and they are likely to, other parts of their religion, specifically those fighting that goddess. But note, that doesn't only mean that you don't get this sort of legitimization because this is a goddess that's perceived to be bad in a lot of cases, but you also make it a lot worse. Because now that's part of feminism is a fight for their identity and parts of their identity which are crucial. This is religious identity now that is being under attack. But moreover, we're going to tell you that even if you legitimize women trying to defend themselves, it is unlikely to be beneficial. So even if, at the end of the day, you accept everything else from government side, the opposition by men who are currently the dominant group is going to cause immense harms specifically to women, specifically because of this policy. CG tells us 2 weird responses. First, they're going to tell us, well, they're not going to interpret it that way because there are other goddesses. A couple of things on that. A, note that probably since religions have also male gods, that it means that they are usually going to fight also male gods, even if they exist, all their other examples even exist at their side house. But moreover, obviously, if I am threatened by something, I don't care that there are 2 examples that don't fit there. If there are 3 that do, this is what causes fear within those groups. They're likely to tap into the examples that fit theirs. That doesn't happen under our side of the house. So we say that you're likely to cause immense harm to women. Secondly, we're going to lose advocacy for these groups, and this is also by itself wins the debate. OG, I'll take you later. So what we opening opposition where we start saying, look, a lot of women are Muslim and are going to be able to relate, and maybe some of them find religion oppressive. Government teams tell you we can also have other symbols, etc., etc. What we tell you about specifically is that the problematic part of the violence. Women were socialized in India to be afraid of violence, to not want to associate with assertiveness and violence. If this is a symbol of their group, they are unlikely to want to associate or support that group. No responses, again, from CG. Secondly, we tell you that the fears of them for being a backlash from men within their community, within their families, is going to cause them to be fearful of associating themselves or supporting these groups. This is where you get a massive loss of advocacy for these groups, but also active disassociation of women from these groups. And not only they have half the support, but the half that lost them now needs to disassociate them. Yes, attack opening, sorry.
Cool. On both sides, men are being incented to preserve their privileges. But now, even if a Hindu man says that women are violent, he can be called un-Hindu, and it is no longer women who are exclusively seen as being antithetical to Hinduism. Why is this not a good thing?
So considering that your stance is that all of them know religion are under status quo, it is unclear why that POI makes a difference under the debate. But moreover, what we tell you is the association of feminist movements with these symbols strengthen that specific perception. It is true that they are fearful right now. If they're going to be extremely more after that, it is a bad thing. What do we tell you? Therefore, we're going to say, so back to the point, we say that you're going to lose massive advocacy for the groups. You're going to create counter groups that try to fight it because they need to disassociate themselves for their own safety. But lastly, we tell you something important. Because both government teams assume that if women act assertively, it's obviously going to be beneficial. And TJ even assume that they are going to organize themselves into violent groups. We bring you a simple analysis. Considering that society right now is extremely violent and fearful of violence, those acts are going to be met with counter-violence. It is true that submission is bad and that not being assertive is bad, but in most scenarios under their side of the house, you're going to get worse consequences for these women. You're putting them in actual risk now. For all these reasons, please oppose.